Hello, this week's Sedra is Sedra Nasso. This week's Torah portion is the longest portion in the Torah, but also one of the most rewarding. Instead of the many lessons at the start of the Sedra, I'm going to focus on the very last verse in this week's portion. There's a fascinating description about Moshe and God in the very last verse of the portion, after the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The last verse reads, "When Moshe went into the tent of meeting, the Mishkan, to speak with God, he would hear the voice addressing Moshe from above the cover that was on top of the ark between the two cherubim. This is how God spoke to him. God speaking to Moshe is nothing new, and God speaking to a Jewish leader after having built the temple is also nothing new. After King Solomon built the temple, the Navi says, when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the royal palace and everything that Solomon had set his heart on constructing, the Lord appeared to Solomon. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and the supplication which you have offered to me. I consecrate this house, the Beis HaMikdash, which you have built, and I set my name there forever. My eyes and my heart shall ever be there." In his explanation of this event, the Radak explained that when God said, my eyes and my heart will be there forever, God meant that his providence will and shall always be at the Temple Mount forever. The Sforno juxtaposed the revelation of God to Moshe and Solomon after the respective building of the tabernacle and the temple in Jerusalem. The Sforno wrote, even though in physical terms the tabernacle was insignificant compared to the magnificent structure that Solomon had built, in terms of spiritual achievement, the tabernacle far outranked Solomon's temple, pretty impressive, which in turn outranked the second temple. During the entire period of the second temple, not a single prophet had been able to enter the temple to hear the voice of God at any moment. If at this point Moshe was able to do this, it proved that God had approved the consecration and had drawn near Moshe as the shepherd of the Jewish people. In spite of all the spiritual grandeur of the tabernacle in the desert and the clear manifestation of God's presence over it or in it, even this was a far cry from the presence of God in the Jewish camp during the period of the revelation at Har Sinai and the 40 days before the sin of the golden calf. Once Moshe entered the tabernacle, he was able to hear the voice of God, something he had been able to hear all the time before the sin of the golden calf, and without the benefit of the tabernacle and the hallowed ground it stood on. The Sforno's explanation is confusing. God spoke to Moshe and King Solomon both after they built their respective edifices. Why does the Sforno see such significance in God revealing himself to Moshe in comparison to King Solomon? The difference between Moshe and King Solomon was the sin that interrupted God's communication with Moshe. Unlike King Solomon, who had a constant rapport with God, after the sin of the golden calf, Moshe's communication with God had paused. This new hearing of God's voice was more than just God approving of the Mishkan. It was a demonstration that God had returned his providence to the Jewish people. The greatest tragedy of the destruction of the temples was not the loss of the buildings, but the loss of the divine providence that protected the Jewish people. Since that loss, we've experienced immeasurable tragedy, exile, crusades, pogroms, and the Holocaust, among so much other pain. On a personal level and on a national level, when we pray for a Messianic era and a return to Jerusalem, we're praying for God to allow us to hear his voice again, just as Moshe did when he built the tabernacle. If we can imagine Moshe's relief and joy, we can picture what Mashiach will do for the Jewish people as well. Shabbat Shalom.